Inside the halls of San Diego State University lies a program dedicated to storytelling and pursuing the truth. Welcome to Where You At, a podcast that takes you inside the work of alumni for the School of Journalism and Media Studies at San Diego State. Our goal is to show the success of our alumni, inspire students with the stories, and connect students and alums on a pathway to journalism success. And now, here's your host, Josh Sushan.
This week on the Where You At podcast, well, it is Super Bowl week, and at least one, there could be more, but at least one San Diego State alum will be covering the Super Bowl because, well, he works for the National Football League Network, the NFL Network. Our guest this week is Omar Ruiz. He attended San Diego State from 1999 through 2002, got his bachelor's at San Diego State, then got his master's at Syracuse. He has worked for some local TV stations in Syracuse, Monterey, California, Columbus, Ohio. He also worked for the National Hockey League's network. He has been with the NFL Network since 2012. He's a reporter. He's a host. Omar, welcome to the Where You At podcast.
Hey, Josh, thanks for having me, man. It's I've heard about this podcast for a long time. It's an honor to be on it now, and especially during this kind of peak time of year for us in my business, our industry, Super Bowl week. And, to talk Aztecs, always makes me happy and especially happy to be on with you here today.
Yeah, especially because of how busy things are, this time of year. Glad that you've made time for us. Let me start right here. So I love that, what if somebody were to tell you question? So let's go back. You're first starting at San Diego State in 1999. If someone would have said, Omar, in the future, you're going to work for the NFL Network, were you more like the confident, cocky kid who'd say, yep, you're absolutely right. That is exactly what I'm going to do. Or were you still trying to find your confidence and think, really? Is that really something that I could do?
Well, I would say I'm probably more the confident, cocky side in that, I went the junior college route and tried to play a little baseball. It was my aspiration to be a big league baseball player. And once I realized that wasn't going to happen, I was in junior college and figuring out, okay, what am I going to do? What do I want to do with my life? And when I was growing up, I grew up in Southern California. When I was 10, we moved to Sacramento, but, I was a Dodgers fan, Lakers fan. So, of course, I grew up listening to Vin Scully and Chick Hearn, two legendary broadcasters in their respective sports, obviously in Southern California. And I just remember thinking that would be so cool to be able to go to the games. I love sports and get paid for it. And so I spent, my 2 years in junior college figuring out, okay, what does this look like? How does this translate for me? And so I took a journalism class there in Sacramento. And once I figured out, okay, this is what I want to do, I kind of felt like I hit the ground running once I got to San Diego State. I had a plan. And so when I got there, I felt like, okay, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. I'm going to make it happen and let's go. So when I first started on campus, living in Aztec Hall in the dorms over by, I don't think they're there anymore. I think they built the new swimming complex or softball field, there where my dorms were. I would have been, okay, Josh, I think you're onto something. I think that sounds like a good career for me there.
I find it really interesting that the quantity of people who work in sports, and that includes myself too. And for some, it was just the love of sports and wanting to get into it. And then from there, you kind of appreciate what it means to be a journalist and sort of the love of journalism. And I know that was the case for me, that it was just, how can I be involved in sports? And then it was, oh no, I really take pride in the journalism aspect of it. How would you describe your arc of athlete to I want to work in sports to no, I take pride in the journalism?
That's a good point. I think for me, my approach is always to maintain that it's never about me, even though, I'm on TV and I'm a performer. I just enjoy the relationships that we build and telling people stories. And so I think that's the heart of the journalistic core of my values, in my job. And I've never been, I'm not one of those insider guys, that break news all the time. So for me, it's never about, being first with the story or any of that. It's sort of reporting on the ground, what's happening, previewing a game, getting good material, post-game information after the game, kind of reporting to the facts and all that. So, yeah, so that's the core of what we do. And I keep that at the heart of what I do. And what I always tell people when I give advice for me is I try to tell stories or present my journalism in a way that it cannot be on the ticker. There has to be more human element to it, more people stories. It's not the transactional stuff that you see on the ticker. It's more to it than that. And I feel like I'm harder to replace that way. If I do that and I can cut out my little niche in the business and the industry. And I think I've, built, now a 21-year career, doing that and keeping, the focus on the subjects of our stories and trying to make it about, more than just sports, just the sort of human interest of everything involved in sports.
Let's reflect some more about your time at San Diego State. You mentioned that once you got to campus, you had an idea. These are the things that you wanted to do. As you reflect, what are some of the most impactful moments, whether that's a class, a classmate, a professor, just experiences? What were those indelible, impactful moments for you?
When you first get there, and especially when you start taking journalism classes, you have to take I think it was the GSP test or the GSP class, the grammar, spelling, and punctuation. And Professor Spivak was my teacher, and just laying the groundwork for the foundation of journalism and understanding the principles of all of that, and how important, even though I'm in broadcast, how important writing still is and communicating with words, and just having a foundation through the different roles that I've had over my career, different places, different jobs. That sort of is at the core of it as well, as far as the presentation goes, the grammar, spelling, punctuation, those sort of standards I still keep. And of course, like in today's Twitter age and social media, a lot of things are shorthand, and you kind of do shortcuts and texting and all this and that, but I still try to maintain those standards. So that's sort of something that was maybe my first journalism class at San Diego State that still sticks with me. The other is probably maybe my second year at San Diego State. I started working at the student radio station, KCR, and eventually I carved out a 10-minute, sports segment within the news program there at the student radio station. And that eventually became a half-hour weekly sports show that I produced and, founded, and eventually had a staff of, 6 or 7 other reporters. And, of course I did football and basketball, and then, other reporters that were trying to get, real world opportunities would cover, Olympic sports and all that. And so of course, when Steve Fisher gets there, I think, we won 4 games or 5 games his first year. And then we were 14-14 his second year. And then of course, we win the Mountain West Conference tournament in 2002, which was my senior year. And having covered the team closely, for that, first few years, to have that magical run in Vegas. And, my buddy Dan Hayes was the sports editor of the Daily Aztec, and I was sort of the head of the student radio station for sports. And, just kind of being there alongside of him and them going on the magical run, and Al Fox hitting the jumper to win it in the semifinals, and then beating UNLV on their home court in the finals, and then going to Chicago for the first round of the NCAA, and doing all that as a student kind of really taught me like, oh, I can do this, like, for a job. I'm doing things alongside actual professional journalists and broadcasters, and I'm right there with them, and I'm asking questions, and I'm getting interviews and all that. So it kind of gave me the confidence that, okay, I can really go for it. It's not just a fun thing that I'm doing in college. Like, I can make a career out of this. So that was probably as impactful as anything else, just the sort of confidence I had. And also, I also give credit to Steve Fisher I always felt treated us, student journalists, student media, as professionally as he did all the, adults in the room, so to speak. And that, him knowing who I was and all that sort of gave me a lot of confidence too, kind of going out into the real world.
That makes me very happy to hear you say that about Steve Fisher. And that does not surprise me to hear that he would treat student journalists the same way that he treats the so-called adult journalists. Let me go from here, though. You get this experience, you have this confidence, but it's a tough industry, Omar. It's tough to find jobs, to get those jobs. And so you ended up going to Syracuse. Describe for us maybe what the job market was like, what you were thinking, and ultimately the decision to move across the country from America's finest city to the snow to continue to get more educated.
Yeah, it's a good question because, like, given those experiences, I felt like I kicked butt at San Diego State and I had all the confidence. And I remember I had interned a couple times at KSWB, the WB affiliate, which I think is now the Fox affiliate in San Diego, under John Hartung, who's now the pre and post game show host of the Dodgers, which is cool to see him on there. But got a lot of experience working behind the scenes. And, when you're out as an intern working at these TV stations, you try to do as many stand-ups as possible and try to present yourself and get a resume reel together to send to TV stations in hopes to get a job. But mine just wasn't that strong. I don't know if I didn't perform with enough confidence or just didn't do enough to get – I didn't really get too many bites on my resume reel. So I was like, okay, how am I going to – now that I've graduated, how am I going to get a better reel together, And so, that was going through my mind. And then I also thought, you mentioned America's finest city. It is. And I was living on the beach my senior year in Mission Beach and just living a great life. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, and because I was aware at that point that, you may have to start off in a small town in middle America somewhere and kind of work your way up the ladder. And I, at that point, like I said, I'm living on the beach, living a good life. I thought, well, I could probably be happy being an insurance salesman, being a high school history teacher, and just living here in San Diego and just having a good life. But I do kind of feel like I have this calling to chase this journalism dream and being a sportscaster. But if I'm going to do it, I want to know that I would be good enough to come back here in San Diego or LA or San Francisco, one of the big California markets, and be able to do that. And I didn't have that, not knowing and, not getting a job right out of college at San Diego State. I kind of wanted to have more certainty before I really pursued this. So I went to Syracuse, the Newhouse School there, Mike Tirico and Bob Costas and Marv Albert and so on and so forth. So many sportscasters over the years had attended that school. And so I figured, okay, I want to go compete against, the best of the best, all these other aspiring sportscasters, and see what I can do. And then the thought process was, okay, well, if I realize I go there and I'm not that good and maybe I can't make a career out of this, back in California, just based on how competitive it is, then I would have a master's degree and I could probably teach at a junior college or professor level, at some sort of, maybe back at San Diego State one day or, something like that. That was the thought process behind it. But I go to Syracuse and I kick butt there too. And I thought, okay, yeah, like I can do this, and started that career path. And by 2013, I was living on the beach in Playa del Rey, California, and it had all come sort of full circle in that regard. So that was kind of a cool moment where in 2002, I'm making these decisions. And by 2013, like, it had come to fruition.
So a lot of things happen over the course of those 10 years, and we can't get into all of that. But in terms of going from Syracuse to Monterey to Columbus to the NHL Network and then ultimately to the NFL Network, how would you pinpoint, like, these are the meetings, these are the people, these are the things that all led to you getting to the NFL Network?
I would just say a lot of hard work, perseverance, that stuff. Always believing in myself. I think that was probably the number one thing, because I remember when I was in Columbus, I was the weekend sports anchor and had been there for 3 years. And I felt, at that time that I had developed enough where I think I'm probably better than weekend sports anchor in Columbus. But like no jobs were coming my way. I didn't have any offers. And so Columbus had, offered another 3-year contract. And I was like, I don't know, I'm a California kid and living in Ohio where, sometimes you don't see the sun for 3 weeks. It was tough, being away from family and friends, was tough. And so I don't know if I could do it. And ultimately, we decided to part ways, and I convinced my girlfriend at the time, or maybe she was fiance at that point, but eventually my wife, like, hey, let's move to Los Angeles. We'll just kind of chase our dreams there, and see if we can make it happen doing, something. And if not, then we have, family and friends there, and, we can just kind of build a life there. She had always wanted to work in entertainment news, so it was kind of an easier sell because, that's where that all is. Like, her dream job was to be a producer at Entertainment Tonight, So once she finished her project that she was working on in Columbus, launching a show there, we moved to LA, and again, it was just sort of on blind faith on my ability. And I eventually got a job at UCLA, doing public address. And then that led to play-by-play for, soccer and water polo and volleyball, doing those kind of sports and kind of helping, keep my feet in this, sportscasting role. We both got jobs doing things, outside of our industry, just to kind of pay the rent and kind of, keep the dream alive. And then that's when the NHL Network came calling. And so I got a job at NHL Network, and obviously having covered, when I was in Monterey, Salinas, Santa Cruz market, we covered the San Jose Sharks pretty closely. And then in Columbus, Ohio, Blue Jackets there. So I had that general knowledge base of the NHL, got that job. And then after that 2011-2012 season of doing that, the NFL Network, which was down the street in Culver City from where we were living, had a job opening, and then kind of led to that. So it's interesting how things work, but I would just say, the sort of belief in self, that taking risks and just kind of making it happen sometimes is how you have to be, and how things work out for, it's, what was that expression? Life favors the bold, or something like that. And so I think that you could sum up my career early aspirations with that expression.
When it comes to jobs that you want or dream jobs, sometimes your opinion might change, and sometimes it's just jobs that are available. In terms of focused on one sport, which you do now and which you did with the NHL, was this something that you always wanted to focus on, just this one sport, just football? Were you someone who liked, covering a variety of sports throughout the year? Or just speak to more what you've learned about the pros and cons of covering different sports to help current students understand what they might be getting themselves into.
I love being a one sport journalist in that I can focus, I have, one of my strengths is I have a great memory. And so, when I first got into this, like I said, I referenced Bob Costas and Mike Tirico. I wanted to be like them and host the Olympics, because I felt like I could, have a strong knowledge base of 28 different sports, because of my memory and kind of how my brain works. And I still have that, but now it's focused on 32 different teams in the NFL. And so I still apply that same skill set to the National Football League, and just, knowing, everything about, all these organizations and just the framework of them and storylines. All that is always kind of going through my head. The benefit that I didn't realize to my job at NFL Network is the enjoyment I get from every other sport, because every other sport, I'm just a fan. And so I can go to Dodger games, and I took my daughter to the World Series in New York for games 4 and 5, and we saw them clinch, and I can go crazy and have a beer and watch my teams. Every March, my buddies and I, we still go to the Mountain West Conference Tournament in Vegas and get to indulge in March Madness. And over the years, I've gone to see the Aztecs play in Providence, Rhode Island, and Spokane, Washington, and of course the Final Four a couple years ago in Houston. And I'm just a fan. I get, put my jersey on, I cheer, and it's fun because now I'm just having fun with sports. But also, too, it gives me, I think, greater appreciation for the fan, for our fan, the NFL fan, and the passion they have and the craziness they have, and not to take that for granted, because sometimes we all get wrapped up like, oh, the fans are too crazy, and they need to relax and just chill. But it's that fandom that really fuels our industries, that fuels my job, essentially. And so to be in touch with that and be in tune with how that feels, because I experience that, every fall with the Dodgers, every spring with the Aztecs and Syracuse Orange. it gives me an appreciation for, the people that, are responsible for our paychecks essentially, and that's the fans. So I think, there's, kind of multifaceted in how it applies to me, both with the job and then just sort of the emotions behind it, kind of focusing on the one sport and the side benefit of, like I said, enjoying everything else.
I like that answer a lot. I really do like that answer a lot. Let's get into some nitty gritty details about what you actually do. And I want to start with just what it's like working on live TV, the challenges, the fun, the surprises, the mistakes. Just in your own words, describe just like what it's like live TV, and you just never know what is going to happen as much as the producers try to plan it out as much as possible.
Yeah, you just have to tap dance. You have to be confident. You can't let one mistake affect another. And because they do happen. A couple weeks ago, it was a Week 18 game in Denver. It was the game where Denver had to win to get into the playoffs, and Kansas City rested all their starters, and Denver ended up winning in a blowout. But pregame, it was a 2:25 local start. So it was the late window game. And usually all the games that we cover on our pregame show, NFL GameDay Morning, on Sundays on NFL Network, it's usually the early window games that get most of the focus. And so I'm there in an empty stadium, and it was 10 degrees, something like that, 10 or 11, and, really cold. So, I'm just so focused and locked in on blocking out the cold and everything. And so I'm doing my report. Rich Eisen tossed out to me, and I'm doing my report. Or actually, it was Colleen Wolfe in that segment who actually tossed out down to me. And the producer starts talking in my ear. So now, and it's usually that because that stuff happens all the time. Producers accidentally talk into your ear, but you're in a loud stadium. There's, crazy fans behind the camera. They're yelling. There's people walking behind you on the sideline. There's all kinds of other distractions. So when they talk to you in your ear, it sort of just blends in with the white noise. But it's an empty stadium because we're, 5-6 hours before kickoff for that particular game. And so I'm hearing everything. So now I'm talking, and I'm trying to process, okay, is he talking to me? Is he giving instructions? Like, maybe I'm not supposed to talk back to Colleen. Maybe I'm supposed to toss to another or something. So I'm trying to pay attention and talk and deliver my report at the same time. And I didn't stumble or flub or anything, but I just started to talk really slowly. And one of my supervisors, called me after. He's like, "You okay?" He thought I was having a stroke or something. But that's just the live TV element. You got to, roll with it. And I said, like, my concentration level is already so high because of the cold. He's kind of blocked that out. And I think I did for the most part that day. But then a voice in my ear, so loud in an empty stadium, quiet stadium. I was like, okay, you kind of have to really focus and concentrate. So it's just kind of like a balancing act, a tap dance, if you will. And I always think of Peyton Manning. You always used to say, pressure is only something you feel when you're unprepared. So it's kind of like, I still get nervous about the performance and stuff, but for the most part, I have pretty good command of the material and what I'm going to say. And so, as far as like that goes and performing, I don't get, nerves too much. Like, you get excited and adrenaline when a show's about to start, or, if I'm in the studio and kind of hosting, kind of come out with all this adrenaline and everything. But yeah, it's just sort of the nimbleness, the flexibility, like you mentioned, when things go wrong or things go unexpectedly, to be able to still do your job or make humor or just roll with the punches when you're on live like that.
Let's talk about the Super Bowl. And full disclosure, Omar and I are recording this episode the day after the championship games. And so the Chiefs and the Eagles just won yesterday. Based on how Omar and I are talking, he's going to cover the Pro Bowl. And then by the time this episode gets published, it will be in the middle of Super Bowl week. So let's get into, I know that there's a lot here, Omar, but in terms of what the NFL Network is doing, specifically what you're doing, take us through a Super Bowl week of the different types of stories, the number of different hits that you're going to do on a number of different shows in order to get everybody ready here for the Super Bowl.
It's funny because in every industry, it seems, they have their Super Bowl, so the Oscars are the Super Bowl of the movie industry. And so, like, in our industry, the Super Bowl is our Super Bowl. It is the Super Bowl. So for us, it's it sort of culminates with that week, and you kind of work harder than you ever have, and you work longer. And just, in the last few years, last year specifically, we'll go through my schedule there. It was in Las Vegas. It was the 49ers and the Chiefs. And it was a rematch of Super Bowl 54 in Miami, a few years ago. And I did that one as well. And so, like for me, I started on Good Morning Football, which was a 4 a.m. Pacific time start. And Super Bowl week is as much as, the camaraderie and the football convention part of it with, everybody from around the world, congregating on the host city, and you get to see a bunch of old friends and everything. So you're going out to dinners and meeting up with people, and, going to bed late, and, waking up at 2 to get back up and to do this 4 a.m. show. And that goes live from 4 to 7, and then the show would re-air. And so then at 10 a.m. that we start with our Super Bowl Live hits, and Super Bowl Live airs from like 10 to 4. And then from 4 to 5 would be NFL Total Access, or, this year it'll be the Insiders. So it's kind of like, you're on TV all day long. And the way it typically happens is, like I had the morning shift where, I would go from 4 a.m. to noon essentially. And then somebody else would come in and do the reports from noon till 5 or 6 or whenever we stopped being live. But for instance, last year, the 49ers a couple of times had their availability when you get the chance to interview the players and the coaches at 4 p.m. So I was going from, I left my hotel like at 3 a.m., get to the Niners hotel, do my reports, go back to my hotel, maybe take a little nap, go back, do my other reports starting at 10 a.m. till noon, go back to my hotel, try to maybe take another nap, lunch, go back out there for the interviews and everything. And so you can imagine it's just a long work day, long work week, and then you try to meet up with some friends for dinner and just kind of rinse and repeat. And for me, the last year, I covered the Niners. The year before that, it was the Eagles assignment I had, the NFC team. And the year before that, the Rams were in it. And so, obviously when you're covering these teams that you have great familiarity with, you try to uncover the stories that people haven't heard. Like I said, a little earlier about, just trying to find these stories that you can't put in a ticker. And so one of the ones that, stand out for me was, this was a couple years ago when it was Chiefs, Eagles, that Jason Kelce, Travis Kelce going against each other. And I remember I asked Andy Reid, because a lot of people knew that Andy Reid drafted Jason Kelce in 2011 or 2012, and then when he got to Kansas City, drafted Travis. So he drafted both Kelce brothers. And so I remember asking him, when he first met Travis, and because everyone, like I said, knew he got drafted. So obviously knew him, Travis Kelce, the prospect, as Jason Kelce's brother when they're in the pre-draft process. But he told me that they actually met a few years before that when Cincinnati, when Travis Kelce was still playing for Cincinnati, they played Temple in Philadelphia. And so Jason Kelce went to go see his brother play. And I think Andy Reid's maybe son, or there was some sort of relation that his kids played for Temple, or there was some connection there. So he was at the game. And so they all met after. And so, discovering that story is like, oh, that was gold. So, because that's something unique, something different that you haven't heard a million times. By the time you get to the 24th week of the season at the Super Bowl, and so to have like fresh material like that, uncover a nugget like that is, for me, what I'm searching for, what kind of makes my job, rewarding. And it was a great story. And, the first time Andy Reid met Travis Kelce, and it was cool, the little anecdote that Andy shared with me. So it's stuff like that, that kind of gets my juices flowing. And then of course, when you start off, I've been at the team hotel when our coverage kicks off, like at, I think 9 a.m., Pacific time, maybe 8 a.m. I forget. It's like an 8.5 hour pregame show. And it's the same thing where I have like the first 4 hours from the team hotel, and then I pass the baton to the other team reporter who's now in the stadium. And we basically, have this shift where I do the reports until the team leaves in the buses to the stadium. And then the reports get taken over by the reporter at the stadium. And then they take it to, kickoff essentially. But that's kind of what the week looks like, game day looks like. And it's a whole lot of fun. And then, you kind of get that exhaustion after the week, usually take a vacation, and then it starts all back up again at the end of the month at the Combine in Indianapolis.
I don't know if you already know this yet, but in terms of for this year's Super Bowl, where will you be watching? What will be your assignments in terms of what are the things that they'll be looking for Omar to be doing for the Super Bowl this year?
I think this year, I think I'm going to be in studio for that Sunday, and they kind of it's so interesting. I think I can share this story now. It's been so many years, but in 2015, my assignment was the 50th anniversary or the 50th Super Bowl in San Francisco, or down in Santa Clara at Levi Stadium, and apparently there was I don't know, maybe some terrorist threats or something like that had been elevated. And so they had me stationed at a marina park in Berkeley, with San Francisco City in the background. And just in case anything happened to the broadcast center or at the stadium, I would go on live right there. And so, at this level, there's all kinds of contingency plans. So we have a presence in the studio that Sunday where, just in case the shot goes down in New Orleans, people have to be on in LA in the studio and kind of go from there. So I think I might be tethered to the studio for that particular day, which, admittedly is not as fun, as being in the actual Super Bowl city. But yeah, so that's kind of what it's looking like this year. But I'm excited to see, Chiefs, Eagles, rematch from a couple years ago. And that came down to the wire. And I would expect this game, because every Chiefs game comes down to the wire, this game would be different. But yeah, so that's kind of what a typical Super Bowl week looks like. And that's probably what my Super Bowl this year is going to look like.
At San Diego State, there's a lot of emphasis these days on mentorship, on being a mentor to someone and what mentors did to help you. So whether it was earlier in your career, when you first started at the NFL Network, I'll leave this open for you. Who, you can pick one or two, whatever you want. Who is a mentor that really did something that really helped you, that helped keep your education going, even when you were no longer taking classes?
Yeah, I would say, well, a couple. I mentioned John Hartung earlier when I was interning for him when I was at San Diego State. I interned at his TV station my second year at San Diego State, and I did intern type of stuff, and then I interned again 2 years later, and I had much more polish to me and understanding of how the business worked and everything. And he entrusted me to essentially be a sports producer. So I would produce the sportscasts and just did all the behind the scenes things that, I would eventually have to do in a smaller market. And then, of course, then you actually go on TV too there, but all the things like editing, going out and doing interviews, writing scripts, all that kind of stuff. So that really empowered me to know that I can do the job in the professional setting, just like when I was doing, the stuff covering the SDSU Hoops Run, doing the stuff, there for my own, sports show, doing that sort of similar type of work at an actual professional TV station, though, kind of empowered me in that way to know, okay, I can do this job. And I had a similar experience with working with Will Selva, who eventually worked at NFL Network. But I grew up in Sacramento, and for one winter break, I think it was when I was in Syracuse, so it would have been after the experience with John Hartung, I interned at Sacramento affiliate TV station for 3 weeks when I was home on Christmas break. And Will Selva was the sports anchor there, and he had me doing the same thing. I remember editing the highlights. It's a famous NFL game. Brett Favre's dad passes away, and then the next day he's playing on Monday Night Football against the Raiders and throws for 4 touchdowns, and it's this celebrated game. And I remember cutting the highlights, in that because he's on right there, and it's a very important game because it was the Oakland Raiders at that point. So Sacramento, Northern California team. So it's very important. I'm cutting the highlights and all this and getting it on there, meeting the deadline and doing all that sort of what felt high pressure in that situation. So again, being empowered to actually do the job and them trusting me and my ability to get the job done, I think were ways that kind of really kind of served as mentors in that way that sort of kind of launched my career path and kind of laid the foundation for, kind of what what I do now, and a lot of the principles that I kind of learned doing that stuff kind of still apply to this day, even though that at the network level, they have editors and all that sort of stuff. I don't do that anymore, but I still think that way, how the visuals work with the words and all that kind of stuff that, all started way back when.
Let me put you on the spot a little bit here, Omar. You work for the NFL Network. That means that they are the league, right? In your mind, or as you work with your colleagues, where's the line? How much does the line shift in terms of what we can and what we can't report about the National Football League when you work for the NFL Network?
Yeah, it's pretty stick to facts type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like we have to wait until let's say a player gets in trouble, with the law or something like that. We have to wait till you get an actual official statement from whatever law enforcement agency is involved in this, as opposed to I think a non-league owned entity can probably go off reliable sources in that case and report what's happening based on that. But we kind of have to go through the official channels before we can report stuff. So there's little differences like that because we are the NFL Network. We kind of tweak, and obviously the owners are our bosses. So I think there's a sensitivity there on what we report on them and their decisions. Because I think, there are people on our air, opinions and analysts, and, that do criticize the owners for, different things and, making, wrong hires. But it has to be based in facts, as opposed to maybe just opinion or, an axe to grind, like you would see on some other networks that are maybe a little more bombastic. That just wouldn't happen at our network. So, those are a couple little differences that I think you see at NFL Network versus maybe some of the other entities. But I think in that regard, it keeps it a little more old school, like how, I think we came up, as journalists and how you report things and kind of how it used to be as opposed to, before everything got into like the 24/7, short attention span audience, kind of changed the game a little bit, but we sort of still operate in that way that I think is a little more throwback to kind of how it was when we were first coming out of school.
Long term, what are you still hoping to accomplish with your career? You're still a young man, Omar. Is there another type of job, another type of assignment that you would love to manifest here on this podcast that you hope to do before your career is done?
No, I mean, I still consider working for the Olympics or at the Olympics would be a career, dream sort of goal. I think in 2004, I interned at NBC when I was at Syracuse at the Athens games. And that was just an amazing experience. And that was the last credit I needed to get my degree there. And just, being exposed to that, the massive, broadcast operation that it is. And it's even more so now with, Peacock and streaming and, 24/7 websites that go to different venues and, all of that is even, more wild than it was back in 2004. But having that experience and just, what the Olympics mean to people, kind of the joining of the world and, kind of putting differences aside and all that kind of stuff I've always felt is a special thing about the Olympics. And so that would, working with them in some capacity or, at the games, especially in 2028, they're coming to LA. So if I could carve out a role, somehow, some way for that, that would be, one of those checkbox type of assignments for me. And but in the meantime, I think I'm enjoying, the NFL. It's the, obviously number one sport in America right now. And, it's kind of been, King Kong for a while. And so, yeah, just kind of riding that wave because, I generally, I do love football. And it's something that, I try to come through in my reporting and broadcasts and all that kind of stuff. So it brings me a lot of joy personally and professionally and hoping to somehow always be a part of that NFL world in some capacity.
All right. Almost done here with Omar. But before we wrap up, whenever I talk to professors at San Diego State, they tell me that more and more students want to be involved in sports broadcasting and sports journalism in some way. You've already done a great job of explaining what it actually means in terms of lack of sleep sometimes and how things can go haywire live. But any other parting advice that you would like to give students about what it means? It can be glamorous, but it can also be really tough as well, about what it means to work in sports journalism.
Yeah, I would say it is tough. You got to have thick skin, and you got to, like I said, believe in yourself, like unwavering belief. But the advice I always pass along to people, because it is so hard, is you have to have a hobby. You have to find something that brings you joy away from work, because it can be an all-consuming type of endeavor. Like, you really have to go for it. And like I said, I went to Syracuse and lived in the crazy snow, negative 25 degrees, and living in Columbus away from my family and friends, and not seeing the sun for 3 weeks, extended periods that you do all these things. You miss so many family moments and weddings, and you sacrifice a lot down the way, and you put so much into it. So when, something negative happens to you at work, you kind of take it so personally, because you put so much of you into it. And so for me, like, I found a hobby, beach volleyball. I play beach volleyball. That's my hobby. So I can get out there, forget about kind of work for a little bit, process, maybe a setback or a adverse situation, and then come back with a clear mind and go from that. Because otherwise, I remember early in my career when, you're kind of even more willing to sacrifice. Now I have, kids that are a priority, and there is less opportunity, to sacrifice time from them. I'm not willing to compromise on that. But earlier in my career, like I said, you do sacrifice so much, and you take things personally. So as a way to kind of not be so obsessed or consumed with everything that you're trying to accomplish and this mountain that you're trying to topple, having a hobby and something to get away from that kind of keeps your mind away and gives you joy, brings you happiness, outside of, your work pursuits, is something that I always encourage, students and people to have.
All right, last topic. We like to brag about other San Diego State alums as we close out the podcast. You mentioned some already. I know that Leah Vallat, she's an alum that's worked at NFL Network as well. Whoever you want, give another shout out to somebody who is making us proud, who's a proud Aztec.
Yeah, I say it's very topical in my line of work, in that two big-time former Aztecs with big-time prominent roles, Kevin O'Connell, the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings, who, is probably going to be in the running for Coach of the Year, which by the time this airs will be announced tomorrow on NFL Honors, and has done a fantastic job. And kind of getting to know him, first, because he started just after I graduated, I believe. So we didn't cross paths, but obviously being in the NFL world, we have. And, first when he was offensive coordinator for the Rams in 21, just a great guy, just, one of these people that you can see why he has so much success, because of his people skills and just how down to earth he is, and how that's all translated to, them winning in Minnesota so frequently and having a terrific year this season. So it's been awesome to see him. And then one of his teammates at San Diego State, Darren Muji, just got named the New York Jets general manager. And I've known him as assistant general manager for the Broncos for years and years. But him and Kevin O'Connell, this story was just told by Kirk Morrison, another fellow Aztec who's doing great in the broadcasting world. Aside on Kirk, I'll throw him in on this, people you're proud of, because he does such a good job for Sirius XM. I know he does the Rams pre and post game show for the radio. He does such a great job as a broadcaster. I sometimes forget how great of a player he was until I see the statistics on some record that he holds for, whether it was the Raiders or, whatever other teams he played for in the NFL. But he tweeted this out, that O'Connell beat out Muji for the starting quarterback position, probably in the Tom Kraft era at San Diego State. And then Darren, goes to be receiver and does a great job there. And now Kevin O'Connell recently signed a big time contract extension. So he'll be in Minneapolis, hopefully for years and years. And then Muji, we wish him all the, success in the New York Jets. And I think, they haven't been to a Super Bowl since Joe Namath in 1969 in Super Bowl III. So if he can be the one that helps lead them to the Super Bowl, he'd be remembered forever in New York So we're wishing him the best of success. And so those two guys, quickly, made me proud recently to see them have so much success and continue hopes to continue to see them do well.
All right, Omar. Well, we are proud of the work that you continue to do for yourself, representing the university and your family. And once again, such a busy time of the year. Thank you so much for making time for us, and continued success, and enjoy the Super Bowl and tell great stories.
All right. Thank you, Josh. Appreciate you having me, man. And I look forward to catching you up in person at some point.
Once again, that is Omar Ruiz, reporter, host of the NFL Network. My name is Josh Sushan. I'm your host for the Where You At podcast. Thank you for listening. Enjoy the Super Bowl, and we will talk to you again next week.
Thanks for listening to the Where You At podcast. This is Devin Watley from the class of 2021. Thanks to Martine Marine for creating the music you're hearing right now, and Alex Piscatelli for her work on the podcast name and artwork on social media. And a reminder to SDSU alums, we really want to know where you're at. Tell us about your career. Get involved in the school. There's many ways you can do this, from donating your time or money, mentoring students, to even speaking in classrooms in person or on Zoom. Your work can help us grow the program and create more opportunities for our students to succeed. Again, thanks for listening. Subscribe to this podcast. Tell your friends. Recommend us a future guest. And go Aztecs.